The airport lounge was alive with its usual rhythm of people moving, speaking, and checking screens. Travelers hurried to their gates, some engrossed in their phones, others scanning departure boards with a sense of urgency. The smell of coffee mingled with the faint scent of jet fuel drifting in from outside. Among the passengers waiting, one man sat quietly, his posture relaxed but his presence unmistakable. He had a calm air, a quiet confidence that set him apart even in a crowd. He was reviewing some documents, focused yet aware of everything around him. He wore a neatly tailored suit that suggested success, but it was his demeanor that truly conveyed authority. Meanwhile, the woman who would soon disrupt the calm walked briskly into the lounge. She had a confident stride and carried herself with an air of entitlement, moving as if she belonged in the best seats without question. Her eyes scanned the room, not with curiosity but with an expectation that things should bend to her will. When she reached the section of the lounge with the executive seating, she noticed a chair that seemed perfect to her. Without hesitation, she made her way to it and sat down as if she had reserved it herself. Other passengers glanced at her briefly but continued with their own activities, not realizing the tension that was about to unfold. The man looked up from his papers, his calm eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement that this seat was not hers to take. He didn't rise immediately or confront her aggressively. Instead, he observed for a moment, assessing the situation. The woman, oblivious to the man's identity, smiled slightly, thinking her boldness would go unnoticed. She tapped her phone and adjusted her bag, fully confident that she had claimed a place in this busy space without challenge. As a few minutes passed, the man finally stood, his movement deliberate and unhurried. He approached her chair with a sense of calm authority that contrasted sharply with her brash energy. Other passengers began to take notice, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. There was a brief pause in the ambient noise of the lounge as people subconsciously turned their attention toward the interaction. The woman, sensing someone approaching, looked up and saw the man standing before her. She didn't recognize him, but she could tell from the way he carried himself that he was not someone to be ignored. "Excuse me," he said politely, his voice even and firm. "That seat is reserved." The woman blinked, slightly taken aback. She laughed nervously, a gesture meant to dismiss the statement. "Oh, I didn't see a sign," she replied, her tone casual, but there was an edge of defensiveness. "I just needed a place to sit." He smiled gently, but there was no humor in it. "I understand, but this seat is reserved for executive guests. It would be best if you could choose another." For a moment, she hesitated, unsure how to respond. She looked around, noticing the other passengers glancing in her direction. Her confidence wavered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't see why it matters so much," she said, leaning back in the chair, trying to assert dominance. "It's just a seat. I need it more than whoever reserved it." The man remained composed, his expression calm. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene. Instead, he maintained eye contact, conveying both patience and authority. The room seemed to hold its breath, sensing the unspoken tension between them. The woman's initial bravado began to falter under the weight of his presence. She had expected a meek passenger, someone who would apologize and move along. Instead, she found herself facing a quiet but unshakable force. A few onlookers whispered among themselves. One woman nudged her companion, murmuring, "Who does he think he is?" Another man shook his head subtly, sensing the irony of the situation. The lounge, usually indifferent to such small conflicts, had unknowingly become the stage for an encounter that would linger in everyone's memory. The man continued to stand there, calm and deliberate. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand compliance. His posture and presence alone communicated a clear message. This was his space, and it was not up for debate. The woman, now more conscious of the scrutiny around her, shifted uncomfortably. She crossed her legs and tried to occupy the chair more fully, as if claiming it by presence could override the quiet authority standing before her. He took another step closer, still calm. "I'm going to need you to move," he said, his tone gentle but firm. There was no anger, no condescension, just the simple, undeniable statement of truth. The simplicity of it made the situation even more awkward for her. She had expected confrontation, perhaps a defensive argument, but not this serene insistence. For a moment, she paused, her mind racing. She weighed the options, to argue further, to claim ignorance, or to comply. She glanced at the people now watching, realizing that her actions were no longer private. Social pressure, combined with the man's quiet authority, began to weigh on her. The hum of the lounge seemed to fade into the background as the focus narrowed to this one small, tense exchange. The man finally extended a hand toward the chair, a polite gesture to indicate that she should vacate it. "Thank you," he said simply, anticipating her compliance. The gesture was not aggressive but commanding in its clarity. The woman froze for a brief moment, staring at the hand and then back at the man. She could sense that this was no ordinary passenger. There was something about the way he held himself, the calm assurance in his eyes, that hinted at authority far beyond the ordinary. She had taken a seat without thinking, assuming that social norms would bend to her favor. Now, faced with someone whose presence alone demanded respect, she felt an unfamiliar hesitation. Minutes felt like hours as she considered her next move. The man didn't rush her, didn't pressure her beyond his simple request. His patience, almost regal in its steadiness, contrasted sharply with her flustered energy. The room, now fully aware of the tension, watched quietly. Some passengers exchanged knowing glances, as if recognizing a story unfolding in real time. Others whispered softly, speculating about the outcome. The dynamics of power, perception, and social confidence played out silently in the small space between them. Finally, she shifted slightly, a small step toward acknowledging reality. She cleared her throat and murmured something about needing to check her phone, a feeble excuse to give herself time. But it was clear that the encounter was already changing her. The realization that this was not an ordinary person began to dawn on her. She had underestimated the man simply because of appearances, failing to recognize the authority and presence that didn't need to be loudly proclaimed. The man, still calm, waited. He didn't gloat or assert dominance with words. His quiet demeanor alone was enough to shift the balance. Passengers continued to observe, some with curiosity, others with quiet amusement at the unexpected drama. It was a subtle but powerful reminder that true authority often requires no aggression, only presence and composure. In that moment, the lounge became more than just a place to wait. It became a stage for human interaction, for the subtle negotiation of respect, and for the realization that appearances can be deceiving. The woman's initial confidence began to crack, replaced by a dawning awareness of the man's true standing. She realized that her assumption, that she could claim a seat without consequence, was flawed. The quiet power of patience, dignity, and calm authority was something she had not anticipated. As the tension lingered, the man returned to his papers, signaling that he was willing to resolve the matter without further drama. The woman, now fully aware of the imbalance, hesitated no longer. She slowly rose from the chair, her actions careful and deliberate, acknowledging, at least subtly, the reality she had initially ignored. The lounge seemed to exhale, returning to its usual rhythm, but the encounter left a lasting impression on those who had witnessed it. Even as normal activity resumed, the subtle lesson lingered. True authority does not need to shout. It does not need to demand. It simply exists and commands respect through presence, patience, and quiet confidence. The woman had learned, in those brief minutes, that assumptions could mislead, and that recognition of others' space, position, and presence is not just polite. It is essential. After the initial tension over the chair, the lounge returned to its usual rhythm, but the air was still thick with unspoken awareness. The woman who had claimed the executive seat now sat a few rows away, fidgeting slightly and stealing glances at the man who had confronted her. The passengers around her whispered softly, some trying to contain their amusement, others trying to understand what had just happened. The man remained at his table, quietly reviewing his documents as if nothing unusual had occurred, but every so often he glanced up, noticing the subtle reactions of those around him. The woman tried to reclaim her composure. She adjusted her posture, crossed her legs, and looked back at her phone, pretending to be occupied. However, her mind was not on messages or emails. She replayed the moment over and over, analyzing how a single request, delivered without anger or aggression, had disrupted her confidence. Her previous sense of control now seemed fragile. She had walked into the lounge with certainty, expecting her presence to be enough to command space. That assumption had been challenged, and she could not ignore it. Around them, life continued. Travelers moved past with rolling luggage, flight announcements echoed through the lounge, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. Yet, the encounter had changed the atmosphere in subtle ways. Conversations paused briefly when eyes wandered to the scene. The onlookers sensed a story unfolding beyond the ordinary. It was a lesson in quiet authority, a demonstration of how calm confidence could shift a situation without words or confrontation. The woman now considered her options. She could act as if nothing had happened, pretending that her boldness was justified. Or she could acknowledge the man's authority in some way, even if silently. She chose a mix of both, sitting still but paying closer attention to her surroundings. She noticed for the first time the way people unconsciously reacted to those who carried themselves with calm assurance. There was respect, even admiration, embedded in the looks they cast toward the man. It was subtle but unmistakable. Meanwhile, the man had not ignored her. His calmness was deliberate, a reflection of years spent navigating challenges without unnecessary drama. He understood that authority was not demonstrated through shouting or forcing compliance, but through presence, patience, and the quiet assertion of one's position. He had allowed the woman to confront the situation her way, giving her space to realize her assumptions. By maintaining composure, he ensured the lesson would be internalized more effectively than any harsh rebuke could have done. Minutes passed, and the woman's internal reflection began to shift. She realized that her actions were influenced not just by her own assumptions but by societal expectations and perceptions. She had acted as though entitlement could dictate reality, overlooking the human aspect of those around her. The man's calm approach had forced her to consider the consequences of her behavior without making her feel humiliated in a way that would provoke defensiveness. It was a subtle but profound moment of self-awareness. As she pondered, the man looked up again, this time making brief eye contact. There was no judgment in his gaze, only observation. It was a reminder that authority and respect were about more than titles or appearances. They were about how one conducted oneself, how one interacted with others, and how one handled situations that could easily escalate. The woman felt a mixture of embarrassment and admiration, a recognition that she had underestimated the quiet power he possessed. Around them, the lounge continued to buzz with activity, yet the tension lingered in subtle ways. A few passengers whispered about the encounter, speculating on the dynamics at play. Some wondered who the man might be, noting his poised presence and the respect it commanded. Others considered the woman's initial boldness, recognizing the common human tendency to make assumptions based on appearances. The scene had become a microcosm of social dynamics, a real-life demonstration of how power, perception, and confidence interact. The woman, still seated, tried to rationalize her initial actions. She had assumed she could claim the seat because of her perceived social advantage, thinking that her presence alone would override any objection. Yet she had encountered someone whose authority did not need validation, someone whose quiet confidence commanded recognition. This realization unsettled her, not because she felt defeated, but because she understood that she had been blind to a truth that was now undeniable. She shifted in her seat, noticing the man's calm focus on his work. He did not seek attention or validation. His authority was intrinsic, derived from his actions, his presence, and his experience. The woman began to understand that true influence was subtle and unassuming. It did not rely on force, intimidation, or loud declarations. Instead, it was demonstrated through integrity, patience, and the ability to maintain composure in unexpected situations. The man glanced around the lounge, noting the small but significant reactions of those present. He understood that this encounter had wider implications, not just for the woman but for the passengers observing the scene. It was an unspoken lesson in respect, humility, and human interaction. By maintaining calm and asserting authority through presence alone, he had created a moment that would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The woman finally adjusted her bag and prepared to move, though not yet fully acknowledging the lesson she had learned. Her pride prevented immediate surrender, but her awareness had shifted. She had recognized that entitlement without understanding carries risk and that quiet authority can be more powerful than forceful assertion. As she rose, she cast a brief, hesitant glance at the man, who returned the look with a calm, neutral expression. There was no triumph in his eyes, only acknowledgement of a human moment unfolding. Passengers nearby began to relax, the subtle tension easing as the immediate confrontation concluded. Conversations resumed, rolling suitcases moved across the floor, and the lounge returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet the encounter had left its mark. The woman, the man, and the onlookers alike carried the memory of the interaction, a reminder of the impact of presence, patience, and quiet confidence. As she found a new seat, the woman reflected on the encounter. She understood, on some level, that her assumptions about social dynamics had been challenged. The man's calm authority had provided a mirror for her own behavior, allowing her to see how her actions were perceived and why they had been ineffective. She realized that true respect is earned not through boldness or entitlement, but through composure, understanding, and acknowledgement of others. The man returned to his work, unfazed by the brief disruption. His documents, notes, and attention to detail signaled a man accustomed to navigating challenges calmly. He understood that every situation offered an opportunity to demonstrate leadership, not through words or gestures, but through consistency, respect, and human connection. His calm response had defused a potentially awkward situation, leaving a lasting impression on those who had witnessed it. The lounge, once a mere waiting area, had become a stage for subtle lessons in human behavior. The woman's internal reflection, the onlooker's quiet observations, and the man's composed authority combined to create a moment that transcended ordinary airport interactions. It was a demonstration of how human behavior, assumptions, and respect intertwine in real-life scenarios, offering insights that linger long after the immediate encounter ends. As the woman settled into her new seat, she noticed other travelers glancing at the man, some with curiosity, others with admiration. She understood that the encounter had highlighted something larger than a single chair. It had revealed the power of calm authority, the importance of awareness, and the subtle ways human interaction shapes perception. She carried a sense of humility now, a quiet acknowledgement that appearances can be deceiving and that respect is earned, not assumed. The man, for his part, continued to focus on his work, his presence a constant reminder of the quiet authority that had defined the encounter. He did not seek attention or validation, yet his impact was evident. The lounge returned to its normal rhythm, yet the memory of the encounter persisted in subtle ways, influencing the perceptions and reflections of those who had witnessed it. The story of a simple chair had become a lesson in human behavior, authority, and the unexpected ways life can teach humility and respect. The lounge had returned to its usual hum, but the atmosphere remained subtly charged. The brief encounter over the executive chair had left an impression on everyone who had noticed it. Passengers continued to sip coffee, scroll through their phones, and glance at flight boards. But there was an unspoken awareness of the man who had calmly confronted the woman. His composed presence seemed to radiate quietly, drawing the occasional glance from people curious about who he was and why he commanded such respect without saying much. The woman, still seated a short distance away, could no longer pretend that the incident had been insignificant. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her bag and smoothing her clothes, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The earlier boldness she had felt had faded, replaced by a dawning understanding that she had misjudged the situation entirely. She had assumed that her social confidence was enough to secure the seat, yet she had encountered someone whose authority was undeniable, even in silence. As she replayed the moments in her mind, she realized that she had underestimated more than just the man's authority. She had underestimated him as a person. His calm demeanor, his steady gaze, and his quiet insistence on what was right conveyed strength and integrity. Unlike many who might respond to challenges with anger, arrogance, or impatience, he had handled the situation with patience and dignity, allowing the woman to recognize her error without publicly humiliating her. The realization left her unsettled but also intrigued. Curiosity got the better of her, and she dared to observe him more closely. He was reviewing documents, occasionally jotting notes with precision, but his eyes never lost awareness of the room around him. There was a rhythm to his movements, a quiet confidence that suggested years of experience and leadership. It was the kind of presence that naturally commanded respect, not through loud declarations, but through consistent demonstration of competence and calm authority. Meanwhile, whispers and subtle glances from nearby passengers continued to remind the woman that she was not alone in witnessing this display. Some were intrigued, others amused, and a few were clearly impressed by the man's quiet authority. She realized that the interaction had extended beyond her personal embarrassment. It had become a small but visible lesson in human behavior. People were noticing the contrast between her initial boldness and his composed response, and it was leaving an impression. The woman's mind raced as she reflected on her assumptions. She had judged the situation based on appearances, expecting the man to be an ordinary passenger who would yield easily. Instead, she had encountered someone whose authority did not rely on appearance or social posturing. She began to understand that true confidence and leadership were demonstrated through actions, patience, and presence rather than through aggressive assertion or entitlement. Her thoughts were interrupted when the man looked up briefly, making eye contact with her. The glance was brief and neutral, carrying neither judgment nor amusement, but it conveyed a subtle acknowledgement. It was a reminder that he was aware of her reflection, and that his calm demeanor had already left an impact. The woman felt a mix of unease and respect, recognizing that the interaction had subtly shifted the balance of understanding between them. Around the lounge, the scene continued to draw quiet attention. Passengers whispered to each other, speculating about who the man might be and why his presence had such an effect. Some guessed he was a business executive, others assumed he might be a high-ranking airline official. No one knew for sure, but the aura of authority he exuded made it clear that he was someone of significance. The woman, meanwhile, tried to focus on her phone, but she could not shake the lingering awareness that she had underestimated him. She remembered the way he had approached the chair without haste or aggression. There had been no rush, no loud demand, just a calm assertion of his position. That quiet, deliberate approach had forced her to reconsider her behavior and her assumptions. She realized that her initial confidence had been based on a superficial understanding of power, one that assumed dominance could be achieved through boldness alone. The man had demonstrated that true authority required patience, dignity, and the ability to maintain composure under pressure. As she continued to reflect, she noticed the reactions of others around her. Some passengers nodded subtly to each other, recognizing the display of calm authority. Others whispered, speculating about the man's identity and achievements. It was clear that the interaction had resonated beyond the immediate moment, leaving an impression on those who had witnessed it. The woman felt a growing awareness that her assumptions had not only affected her own experience but had also shaped the perception of those around her. The man, oblivious to the internal reflections of the woman, returned to his documents with quiet focus. He moved with purpose, yet without urgency, demonstrating a mastery of balance between attention to detail and awareness of his environment. His actions were precise, measured, and deliberate, conveying competence and confidence. The woman could not help but notice the contrast between his calm authority and her own earlier brashness. She felt a subtle shift in her perspective. The encounter was no longer just about a chair. It had become a mirror reflecting her assumptions, her sense of entitlement, and her understanding of authority. She recognized that her initial behavior had been guided by superficial perceptions, while the man had acted from a place of genuine experience and confidence. It was a lesson in humility, one that she could not ignore. As she watched him, She began to appreciate the subtle ways in which people influence each other. His calm presence had transformed what could have been an uncomfortable confrontation into a moment of reflection and learning. She realized that authority and respect are earned not through aggression or entitlement, but through consistency, composure, and human connection. The impact of such quiet leadership was profound, leaving lasting impressions without overt displays of power. Around them, the lounge continued to operate normally, yet the encounter had subtly changed the dynamics. Passengers moved with awareness, conversations carried undertones of curiosity, and the simple act of observing became an opportunity for reflection. The woman felt a mixture of embarrassment, respect, and intrigue as she considered the implications of the interaction. She had underestimated the man, but now she recognized the depth of his presence and the quiet power of his composure. Her thoughts wandered to the broader implications of the encounter. She considered how often people make assumptions based on appearances, social expectations, or perceived status. The man had challenged those assumptions effortlessly, demonstrating that true authority does not require validation from others. It exists independently, grounded in experience, integrity, and the ability to handle situations with calm and dignity. She felt a renewed awareness of the importance of humility, observation, and respect in interactions with others. As she continued to sit quietly, she noticed the subtle reactions of those around her. Passengers who had witnessed the initial interaction were now processing it in their own ways, some with amusement, others with reflection. The man's composed demeanor had left an impression on the observers, highlighting the contrast between quiet authority and assumed entitlement. The woman recognized that this encounter was not only a personal lesson, but also a shared experience that affected the perceptions of those who had witnessed it. The man glanced around the lounge once more, his awareness of the environment evident in the measured way he observed others. He did not seek recognition or validation. His authority was intrinsic, grounded in presence and competence. The woman, now fully conscious of the impact of her assumptions, felt a sense of respect and humility. She understood that the encounter had revealed the subtle but powerful ways in which human behavior, perception, and authority intersect. As time passed, the woman continued to reflect on the interaction. She recognized that her initial approach had been guided by confidence without understanding, a reliance on perceived social advantage rather than awareness of context and human dynamics. The man's calm response had provided an unexpected mirror, forcing her to confront her assumptions and reconsider her approach to interactions. It was a lesson in observation, patience, and the understated power of quiet authority. The lounge, once a simple waiting area, had become a space of subtle education. The woman, the man, and the passengers around them had participated in an unspoken exchange, a demonstration of how presence, composure, and integrity can influence perceptions and interactions. The incident with the chair, seemingly minor, had evolved into a meaningful encounter with lasting implications. Finally, as she prepared to move or adjust her position, the woman felt a quiet acknowledgement of the man's authority. She understood that her assumptions had been flawed, and that true influence is demonstrated not through entitlement or boldness, but through consistent composure, awareness, and human connection. The encounter had transformed her understanding of respect and authority, leaving a lasting impression that would inform her behavior in future situations. The man continued to focus on his documents, unfazed by the reflections and thoughts of those around him. His calm presence, unshakable composure, and quiet authority had already made an impact, teaching lessons that extended beyond the immediate moment. The lounge returned to its familiar rhythm, yet the encounter remained in the consciousness of all who had observed it. It was a subtle but powerful demonstration of human dynamics, humility, and the influence of composed authority in everyday situations. The lounge seemed to hum with its usual background noise, but there was a subtle shift in energy. The earlier tension over the executive chair had settled, yet the air carried the residue of curiosity, reflection, and unspoken lessons. The woman who had claimed the chair now sat quietly, trying to regain her composure. She adjusted her bag, shifted her weight, and tapped idly on her phone, yet her mind was far from idle. She was replaying the interaction repeatedly, analyzing every gesture, tone, and expression, trying to understand what had just happened and why it had affected her so deeply. The man who had confronted her returned to his work, reviewing documents with steady focus. His presence, calm and unshakable, continued to draw occasional glances from other passengers. There was a quiet dignity in the way he moved, in the way he carried himself. It was the kind of authority that did not need to be announced or proven. It existed naturally, inherent in his demeanor and his actions. Observers could feel it, even without knowing who he was or what he had accomplished. The woman, increasingly aware of the aura around him, began to recognize that her assumptions had been entirely misplaced. For a moment, she allowed herself to look directly at him, trying to assess what it was about him that had so effortlessly unsettled her. There was no arrogance, no desire to dominate or intimidate. Yet, every action, every subtle gesture, carried a quiet weight that demanded acknowledgement. She realized that she had encountered someone whose authority was not just social or situational, but personal. It came from experience, self-assurance, and a deep understanding of human behavior. This recognition unsettled her, forcing her to confront her own assumptions and behaviors in a way that felt uncomfortable but enlightening. The passengers nearby, who had witnessed the initial exchange, were now observing the unfolding dynamics with more attention. Some whispered softly to each other, speculating about the man's identity, while others quietly admired the way he had handled the situation. The lounge, usually indifferent to minor conflicts or disputes, had become a microcosm of social lessons. It was an unspoken study in human interaction, where patience, composure, and authority were demonstrated through subtle, deliberate actions rather than overt confrontation. The woman's thoughts returned to the moment when he had asked her to vacate the chair. She had expected resistance, perhaps irritation, maybe even a confrontation. Instead, she had been met with calmness, with an unspoken confidence that left little room for argument. That calm authority had shifted the balance in ways she could not ignore. She realized that her initial boldness had been rooted in assumptions about entitlement and social expectation, not in actual understanding of the person she confronted or the situation at hand. She observed the way he interacted with the lounge environment. His awareness of the surroundings was quiet but precise. He noticed the subtle cues from passengers around him, the soft glances, the whispered conversations, and the fleeting expressions of curiosity. Yet he did not let any of this distract him from his focus. His ability to maintain composure, to carry out his tasks efficiently while being attuned to the environment, spoke volumes about his character and experience. It was clear that he was accustomed to navigating complex social dynamics with ease and grace. Her mind wandered to her own behavior. She had acted from a place of perceived social confidence, assuming that assertiveness alone would secure the chair. She had failed to consider the human element, the depth of experience, and the inherent authority that the man possessed. The realization stung not as a punishment, but as a revelation. It forced her to reevaluate how she approached interactions and how she assessed people based on appearances or initial impressions. As she sat quietly, she began to notice the reactions of others around her. Some passengers were nodding subtly to one another, recognizing the demonstration of quiet authority. Others whispered, speculating about who the man might be, acknowledging the impact of his calm, composed presence. The woman felt herself observing not only the man but also the effects he had on those around him. It was a lesson in how influence and respect operate subtly, without force or loud assertion. The man glanced briefly in her direction, his expression neutral yet attentive. There was no judgment, no gloating, only an acknowledgement of the human interaction that had taken place. This simple gesture carried weight, reinforcing the idea that authority and respect are often demonstrated through observation, awareness, and integrity, rather than through overt displays of dominance. The woman felt the weight of this realization, understanding that she had underestimated not only the man but also the subtle power of composed presence. Her thoughts returned to the concept of leadership. She began to see that true leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room or the most assertive personality. It is about composure, clarity, awareness, and the ability to influence others through presence and integrity. The man had demonstrated all of these qualities effortlessly, creating a moment that was instructive not through words or confrontation but through quiet, deliberate action. It was a subtle reminder that power and influence are often most effective when exercised with patience and self-assurance. The lounge continued to operate normally, yet the scene had left a lasting impression. Passengers who had witnessed the initial exchange continued with their activities, but their awareness had been heightened. The interaction between the woman and the man had transformed an ordinary waiting area into a space of reflection and subtle social learning. The woman, in particular, felt a shift in perspective, recognizing that assumptions based on appearances or perceived social advantage could be misleading and potentially costly. She considered how often people judge others based on superficial impressions. In her case, she had assumed that boldness and assertiveness would secure the chair, that her social confidence would be sufficient. She had failed to recognize the depth of experience, the quiet authority, and the composure that the man possessed. This recognition brought a sense of humility and a deeper understanding of the dynamics of human interaction. She realized that respect, authority, and influence are earned through character, patience, and awareness, rather than through entitlement or aggression. The man, still focused on his work, occasionally glanced around the lounge with measured attention. He did not seek acknowledgement, yet his presence had already made an impact on those around him. His calm demeanor, combined with his awareness of the environment and the people within it, created a subtle but powerful influence. The woman could not help but reflect on the contrast between her initial approach and the man's composed response. It was a lesson in humility, observation, and the understated power of quiet authority. As time passed, the woman's reflection deepened. She considered how her assumptions had shaped her behavior and how the man's calm response had guided her toward understanding. She recognized that true authority does not require confrontation, loud declarations, or forceful assertion. It is demonstrated through patience, presence, integrity, and the ability to navigate human interactions with composure. The encounter over the chair had provided a vivid illustration of these principles, leaving a lasting impression on her understanding of respect and human behavior. Around them, the lounge gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Travelers moved with rolling luggage, conversations resumed, and the hum of activity filled the space once more. Yet the memory of the encounter lingered in the minds of those who had observed it. The woman, in particular, carried the awareness of her misjudgment, the subtle lesson in humility, and the recognition of the quiet authority that had confronted her assumptions. It was a moment that would shape her perspective on social interaction and respect for years to come. The man continued his work, undisturbed by the reflections of others. His presence remained calm, authoritative, and dignified, reinforcing the lessons that had already been imparted through action rather than words. The woman's growing awareness, coupled with the observations of the passengers around her, demonstrated the enduring impact of subtle, composed authority. It was a reminder that human interactions are complex, nuanced, and often most instructive when handled with patience, clarity, and integrity. As the woman finally adjusted her bag and prepared to move or reposition herself, she felt a quiet acknowledgement of the man's presence and the impact of the encounter. She had learned that assumptions can be misleading, that entitlement is not a substitute for awareness, and that true authority is demonstrated through consistent, composed action. The lounge, now fully back to its routine, held the subtle echoes of a lesson in humility, respect, and the power of quiet leadership. The encounter, though brief and seemingly ordinary, had revealed profound truths about human behavior, perception, and interaction, leaving a lasting impression on all who had been present. The lounge slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the encounter over the executive chair lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Passengers returned to their own routines, some sipping coffee, others checking flight boards, but a subtle awareness remained. The man continued reviewing his documents, calm and focused, while the woman who had initially claimed the chair now sat quietly, her thoughts occupied with the lessons she had learned. The incident, though brief, had left a mark on everyone involved, shaping perceptions in ways that were quietly profound. The woman reflected on the unfolding events. She realized that her assumptions had been wrong, that her confidence had been misplaced, and that she had underestimated someone whose authority did not rely on appearances or social posturing. The calm, measured way the man had addressed the situation had forced her to recognize the difference between perceived and genuine authority. She had learned that true influence and respect are not achieved through boldness or entitlement, but through patience, composure, and integrity. As she replayed the moment in her mind, she noticed the subtle ways in which her behavior had shifted. She had started the encounter with a sense of entitlement, believing that she could claim a space simply because she desired it. Now, she felt a mixture of humility, awareness, and reflection. She understood that respect for others, recognition of their presence, and acknowledgement of authority were not just social niceties, but essential components of human interaction. This realization resonated deeply, shaping the way she intended to approach situations in the future. The man, for his part, remained composed and unbothered by the lingering attention. He understood the power of quiet authority and had demonstrated it without aggression, without judgment, and without unnecessary attention. His focus on his work, combined with his calm awareness of the lounge and its occupants, created a natural influence that affected everyone who had witnessed the encounter. His actions were a reminder that true leadership and respect are cultivated through consistent behavior and mindful interaction rather than through force or arrogance. Passengers around them began to process what had happened. Some whispered to each other, speculating about the man's identity and the depth of his experience. Others observed the subtle dynamics between him and the woman, noting the contrast between her initial assertiveness and his composed presence. The lounge, which had been a neutral space for waiting, had transformed into an arena for understanding human behavior, influence, and respect. The encounter had provided a lesson in humility and awareness that extended beyond the immediate participants. The woman, now fully aware of the impact of her assumptions, considered how often people misjudge situations based on appearances or preconceived notions. She reflected on her initial confidence, recognizing that it had been superficial and dependent on external factors. In contrast, the man's quiet authority had emerged naturally from experience, integrity, and a deep understanding of human dynamics. She realized that these qualities, though less visible, had far greater influence and longevity than the fleeting power of perceived social dominance. Her thoughts wandered to the concept of human connection and interaction. She had assumed that her presence alone would shape the situation in her favor, overlooking the importance of awareness, empathy, and recognition of others. The man's response had demonstrated that true influence involves understanding the people around you, observing their reactions, and guiding situations through composed and deliberate action. It was a lesson in patience, reflection, and the understated power of presence. Around them, the lounge returned to a familiar rhythm, yet the impact of the encounter continued to resonate. Travelers moved with purpose, rolling suitcases clattered lightly against the floor, and conversations resumed, but the memory of the incident remained. The woman occasionally glanced at the man, now fully aware of his significance, feeling a mixture of respect and introspection. The lesson she had absorbed was subtle but lasting, reminding her that human behavior and authority are complex, nuanced, and often most impactful when demonstrated through quiet, composed actions. The man remained focused on his documents, seemingly oblivious to the reflections of those around him. Yet his calm presence and consistent composure had already left a lasting impression. The woman felt a sense of gratitude, though unspoken, recognizing that the encounter had provided her with insight and perspective she might not have gained otherwise. She understood that this was not about winning or losing, but about understanding the dynamics of respect, authority, and human interaction. She reflected on her assumptions about entitlement and boldness, realizing that confidence without understanding is fragile. The man had exemplified the principle that true authority is grounded in integrity, experience, and awareness. It is demonstrated through actions and presence rather than through force, loud words, or social posturing. She recognized that this lesson would stay with her, influencing her approach to interactions in both personal and professional contexts. Passengers around them continued their routines, yet the encounter had subtly altered their perceptions. Some noted the contrast between appearance and reality, observing how calm composure could command respect and attention more effectively than assertive behavior. Others reflected on their own assumptions about social dynamics and the importance of recognizing authority beyond superficial cues. The lounge had become more than a place to wait. It had become a space for observation, reflection, and learning about human behavior. The woman, now more thoughtful and self-aware, considered the broader implications of the encounter. She realized that the lessons she had learned were applicable not only in this moment but in countless situations where assumptions, appearances, and perceived authority influence behavior. The man's calm and composed response had provided a model for effective interaction, demonstrating that respect and influence are cultivated through mindfulness, awareness, and integrity rather than through entitlement or aggression. As she prepared to move or adjust her position, she felt a quiet sense of acknowledgement and respect for the man. She had gained insight into the subtle dynamics of human interaction and the understated power of presence and authority. The encounter had transformed a simple situation over a chair into a meaningful lesson in humility, awareness, and human behavior. She understood that true respect is not demanded, it is earned, and it is reflected in the way individuals carry themselves and interact with others. The man continued his work, undisturbed by the reflections and observations of those around him. His calm presence and composed demeanor had already imparted lessons that would resonate far beyond the immediate moment. The woman, along with the other passengers who had witnessed the interaction, carried a renewed understanding of respect, authority, and human connection. The lounge, once merely a waiting area, had become a stage for reflection, subtle learning, and the demonstration of quiet, powerful influence. In the final moments of the encounter, the woman took a deep breath and allowed herself to fully recognize the impact of the experience. She understood that her assumptions had been challenged, that her confidence had been tempered by humility, and that her awareness of human behavior had been expanded. The man's quiet authority had taught a profound lesson in patience, composure, and the understated power of presence. It was a reminder that true influence is demonstrated through consistent behavior, integrity, and awareness, rather than through entitlement, aggression, or superficial confidence. As the lounge returned to its normal rhythm, the story of the chair and the quiet confrontation lingered in subtle ways. The woman's reflections, the observations of the passengers, and the presence of the man had created a lasting impression. The encounter had shown that authority and respect are often most effectively demonstrated through calm, deliberate action, and that human behavior is best understood through observation, awareness, and integrity. The incident, brief though it was, had transformed the space and left lessons that would be remembered long after the passengers moved on to their flights. The woman finally adjusted her bag, rose from her seat, and acknowledged the man with a subtle nod, a silent recognition of the lesson learned. She understood that life often presents unexpected moments that challenge assumptions, reveal truths, and teach humility. The man, focused on his work, continued to embody quiet authority, leaving the woman and others with a renewed appreciation for composure, presence, and respect in human interaction. The lounge, once ordinary, had become a setting for reflection and learning, demonstrating that even small encounters can carry profound meaning and lasting impact.